Great. Good morning. My name is Sterling Kiga, Chairperson of the Authority. I'd now like to call to order the September 4th, 2024 at-large Authority meeting of the Hawaii Community Development Authority. The time is now 9:32 a.m.
Thank you, Chair. In accordance with Section 92-347 Hawaii Revised Statutes, the Hawaii Community Development Authority is holding today's at-large board meeting virtually on Zoom. The Zoom link details were included on the meeting agenda. Therefore, members of the public are welcome to join us on Zoom and also at our physical meeting site at the American Brewery Building, 547 Queen Street, second floor boardroom, Honolulu, Hawaii, 96813. The HCDA communications staff is hosting this meeting. Once this meeting begins, everyone will be muted for clearer audio. Board members, if you have any comments or questions, please unmute yourselves to speak. It is important that all individuals clearly state their name each time prior to speaking. If you wish to provide oral testimony and you are attending virtually, please indicate so by clicking the raise hand button found on your Zoom screen. If you're attending in person, you'll be called to the front of the room in the order that you signed up. All testimony will be limited to a maximum of 3 minutes. Your testimony must be related to the agenda. Before you begin your testimony, we ask that you identify yourself and spell your name for the record. When 1 minute is remaining, 1 minute remains will be called out. When 30 seconds is remaining, 30 seconds will be called off. The time has elapsed, time will call, after which you will have 30 seconds to conclude your testimony, and then your audio will be turned on. If you are attending in person, the presiding officer will call the next testifying. Keep in mind that this is an opportunity to share your thoughts with us. If you ask questions during your testimony, neither the board nor the staff is required to provide an answer. If the authority's connection for the remote meeting is lost, the meeting will be recessed until the connection is restored. If the connection cannot be restored within 30 minutes, the meeting will be terminated and the authority will continue the meeting at another notice date. Thank you, Chair.
HCDA board members, please remain visible and audible during the meeting. Also, please acknowledge you are present by either saying here or present. Let the record reflect that the following members are present. Vice Chair Ishii. Here. Secretary Apo.
Here.
Member Miranda Johnson.
Here.
Member Anderson.
Here.
Member Evans.
Here.
Member Schreitz.
Here.
Member Blystone.
Ew.
Member Suji.
Present.
Member China. Member Sakota. China or Sakota? Member Lidstone.
Ew.
Member Ray.
Here.
Member Leong.
Here.
Member Light.
Here.
Member Kabibi.
Here.
Member Yamasaki.
We're called. Let's go back to member Chia.
Member China.
Having technical issues, but what can I get across?
Okay, well, please press.
Is member Blystone on? No, yeah, it sounded like she. Member Blystone.
Oh, was that?
Yeah, I
Member
think it was
Blystone.
member Blystone.
Yeah, sure. Okay, great. For today's meeting, board members will have an opportunity to ask questions or provide comments after an agenda item has been presented. Individuals from the public who have requested to provide verbal public testimony on a specific agenda item are on standby and will be permitted to provide their testimony respectively. Agenda item number 2, approval of minutes, regular meeting minutes of August 7th, 2024. Board members, are there any comments or corrections to these minutes? If there are no comments or questions, the minutes are approved as presented. Item number 3, for information and discussion, an informational presentation by Professor Sokyong Fang, Celia Mo Chair, Professor of Economics at the School of Economics, Singapore Management University, on value capture and housing affordability, insights from Singapore. Craig Nakamoto, Executive Director, will now introduce the presenter.
Thank you, Chair. I'm really pleased to introduce Dr. Sokyong Fang. She is the Celia Mo Chair, Professor of Economics at the Singapore Management University. Her research interests are in housing, transportation, and infrastructure economics, and she has authored the following books: Policy Innovations for Affordable Housing in Singapore, Housing Finance Systems, Market Failures and Government Failures, and Housing Markets and Urban Transportation. She has also published numerous book chapters and journal articles on housing, transportation, regulation, and public-private partnerships. At SMU, Professor Pang was Vice Provost for Faculty Matters and was Program Director for the Growing Infrastructure Executive Program, which was jointly developed by SMU, Infrastructure Asia, and the World Bank. In addition to her work at SMU, Professor Pang has served as a consultant to the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, and various government agencies on projects involving land, housing, and infrastructure policies. In Singapore, Dr. Pang has previously served as a member of the Urban Redevelopment Authority, Land Transport Authority, the Public Transport Council, the Competition and Consumer Commission, and the Energy Market Authority. Professor Pang received her PhD in economics from Harvard University in 1989. Please join me, board members, in welcoming Dr. Pang.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to your board meeting to make a presentation on Singapore's land and housing policies. I will first provide some background information on Singapore, then explain its policies for land and housing and how government land sales are arranged. And then I will look at the fiscal implications for land value capture for Singapore. Throughout, I will be using the Singapore dollar, which is about 3/4 American dollar. Well, Singapore's unusual housing policies must be understood in the context of its very small land area. It is both a city and an independent republic of 6 million people with a land area of only 730 square kilometers. So besides housing, it has to also find space for all the normal functioning all the requirements of a normal functioning country, which includes commercial industrial areas, ports, airports, military installations and training grounds, water catchment, and parks. To put this in perspective, Singapore's population is 5 times that of Oahu's, and Oahu's land area is more than double that of Singapore's. So Singapore's land scarcity explains land and housing solutions that will appear drastic for other countries. There it is. And then
No, you want to, yeah. You have share screen. Sharing the wrong screen now.
it's sharing the wrong screen. Everyone was the PDF online.
Sorry about the technical difficulties. Go ahead.
Well, despite its small size, Singapore has thrived economically. The US Heritage Foundation actually ranks Singapore as the world's freest economy, but that could hardly describe Singapore's land and housing policies, which sees extensive government intervention and regulation. So what do I mean by that? Well, this is our Land Acquisition Act, which was enacted in 1966. Singapore began as a British trading port back in 1819. In 1959, we were granted self-government by the British government, and in 63 we merged with Malaysia. In 65 we got expelled from Malaysia and therefore became an independent city-state. So soon after independence, in a state of emergency and crisis, we enacted the Land Acquisition Act, which gives the state broad powers to acquire land for any public purpose, okay, by any agency of the government, for public purposes, as well as for any residential, commercial, or industrial purpose. So it's most like for any purpose. And landowners cannot object to the decisions, and appeals on compensation could only be made to the appeals board and not to the courts. So this was considered necessary because at that point in time, we were facing a housing crisis. It was post-World War II. There was massive overcrowding, and there was a need to redevelop the whole central area. So by in 1965, the state owned about 49% of the land. By 2005, it was 90% of the land was now owned by the state. This included actually land reclamation, which increased Singapore's land area by 25% since independence. So land reclamation is a continuous process in Singapore. In terms of land use planning, we had a master plan that was given to us by the British colonial government, modeled after the Greater London Plan. And soon after self-government, the plan was found to be too restrictive, and therefore public sector projects were exempted from the requirements of the plan. And in 1964, an amendment was introduced to introduce a development charge was made, and that meant that any change in land use, rezoning, or up density that was approved for the private sector would see a betterment charge or tax on the increment in land value. And currently, we call it a betterment charge, and it's about 70% of the increment of land value. The table is provided and updated every half year. In terms of planning, in 1971, the United Nations held a concept plan was drawn up, and in 1990, there was a change in the way we do land use planning from passive updating of the master plan to reflect changes in planning permission to one that was forward-looking and which provided guidance on permissible land use and density for development, so as to guide private sector development that was permitted under the master plan. So the long-term plan is for the next 50 years, is reviewed regularly. The master plan is for the next 10 to 15 years, is reviewed every 5 years. So in terms of how the master plan is implemented, the land use planning process is such that every 5 years, the master plan is updated. The land use planners will propose amendments to the master plan, such as a change in zoning, change in plot ratios, designation of conservation areas, etc. And these proposals are exhibited for public inspection and comments. And after that period, the proposals are submitted to the minister for approval, and then the amendments are incorporated into the updated master plan. The master plan is supported by special and detailed plans for specific areas which are non-statutory, so that the public can actually have reference to what are the plans contained for each area and each plot of land almost. So to bring the plans to reality, the state land is either allocated to public sector agencies or is released for private development to the government land sales program. So this is the sequence of events for how the planning process is conducted. Through this planning process, we have the housing sector, which is an important part of the plan. The home ownership rate is now about 90%. We have the Housing and Development Board, which actually is a developer for housing, government agency, set up in 1960, soon after we attained self-government. And the HDB actually is the biggest developer in Singapore. The housing stock comprises 71% of HDB flats, and these are all high-density, high-rise towns. And 94% of the HDB units that have been developed have been sold for ownership purpose. Only 6% are for rental, and they are sold on leasehold of 99 years. On the private side of the housing market, there's about 24% private high-rise condominiums. These are both freehold and leasehold. The leasehold ones to be from land released through the government land sales program for private sector housing development. And for private landed properties, these are mostly freehold and they comprise only about 5% of the housing stock. The most common house type is therefore a HDB flat, and a HDB flat provides flats of different sizes ranging from the 1-room flats to the 5 rooms executive condominium flats. And the largest segment of the market is a 4-room flat, which is the medium house type in Singapore. It's a 99-year lease, about 970 square feet, and 3 bedrooms. We call it a 4-room flat. It's a 3-bedroom flat, and the market price is for less than $500,000 US, but the subsidized price is actually about half the market price. So how do we subsidize these flats? So that's next part of the story. So the house price to income ratio is actually a useful indicator that is used widely to measure housing affordability. So in Singapore, the market price of a 4-room flat to the medium household income is about 4.7. For Honolulu and other high housing cost US cities, the house price to income ratios are actually higher, which means that in the range of unaffordability for the medium household. But these are in the US cities, you're talking about single family homes. In Singapore context, we're talking about a 4-room HDB flat, 99-year lease. So how did we arrive at 90% home ownership besides the HDB's building program that supplies the flats? On the demand side, in 1968, the government found that most households were not, especially the lower income households, were not wanting to be homeowners. They didn't understand mortgages. They didn't have the necessary savings to make a deposit for down payment. And so the Central Provident Fund scheme, which was a pension fund scheme with individual accounts, was amended so that the savings in the Central Provident Fund could be used for housing. So the contribution rates have increased over time and also been reduced over time as well. So currently, the contribution rates are 20% from the employee and 17% of the wage for the employer, for a total of 37%. So that's a very high compulsory savings for an employee. It goes into their CPF account and it's proportioned into 8% for health, 6% for retirement, and 23% for in the ordinary account for housing or other investments. But most first-time homeowners will be using that account for housing deposits, housing down payments, and housing mortgage payment purposes. So this system actually allows facilitated the home ownership because the housing account cannot be used for rental payments, can only be used for home ownership. So by 1968, we have actually put in place a framework for home ownership with the HDB supplying 99-year leasehold flats and households making compulsory savings to the CPF, which then, on behalf of the households, will make the down payment and mortgage payments to the HDB directly, so that it bypasses the household, which might actually default if not for the fact that it was compulsory savings in the CPF. So therefore, the default rates are very low, and that actually reduces the risk premium required for the mortgage rates. And the HDB itself will grant the mortgage loans to the households to buy the HDB flats. So the HDB is not just the provider, the supplier of housing developer, but it's also the biggest mortgage bank, the biggest housing bank well, during a period of time when the commercial banks were not in the HDB market. Later on, the commercial banks actually were allowed to make loans for HDB, and the mortgage loan interest rate from the HDB is 2.6%. No subprime rates, everybody gets a flat 2.6% rate from the HDB if they buy either a new flat or a resale flat. Actually, commercial bank rates during the period of very low interest rate had rates that were lower. So some people actually switched to commercial banks. When we look at the HDB building statistics, it has been during the 1970s and 80s, there was a massive building program so that people could be resettled in house. And by the 1990s, we basically had met all the requirements of housing the population. But currently, HDB continuously have been providing about 20,000 flats a year, which corresponds roughly to the first-time marriage rates in Singapore. Okay, so that first-time homeowners would be assured of getting a HDB flat. So if you look at the HDB's contribution in terms of its building statistics, those are the vertical lines. That's the red lines. And then the vertical lines are the home ownership rate. So they have moved in tandem as HDB supplied housing. The home ownership rate has increased over time. And by 1990, we are seeing about 90% home ownership rate. So over time, by the 1990s, with most of the population already owning home, the resale market was deregulated for HDB flats, so that those who have actually lived in their flat, occupied their flat for at least 5 years, could start on the resale market. And so there's a thriving resale market, which is open to households who don't meet the requirements to be new flat owners. People's income ceilings have exceeded the HDB cap of 14,000, or those who are downsizing from the private sector or permanent residents, but they need to be citizens or permanent residents. But there's still foreigners are still kept out of that resale market. So there are at least 3 prices in the HDB market. So you look at this is a typical prices that are put up when HDB launches flats for sale. So for example, in this town called Punggol, there's a certain project, and then they will have the sticker prices, which is like the prices which are listed for this for 2 rooms, 3 room, 4 room, 5 room flats. And there's a resale market price which are much higher, usually much higher than the sticker prices. And then there's a net price, because depending on the household income and the household situation, the net prices are the sticker price minus the housing grants. So there are housing grants that are given by the government to households that are dependent on the household's income to make sure that households at every income level can become homeowners. So the assumption there is a 2-room flexi flat that for this particular exercise, assumptions of 80,000 grant for the 2-room flexi flats, that brings down the net price to 131 minus 80,000, which is 51,000. So the housing grants are provided for below medium income households, and they range from, we just made an adjustment 2 weeks ago to increase the amount of grants to 120,000 for the lowest tier of income household, and it goes down, it's progressive. The higher income households get less and less grants, and by the medium income households will be paying the sticker price, which is still below the resale market price. So that's for the new flats. For those who choose to buy in the resale market, which doesn't require a waiting period for the new flat to be built, and there's also a better range of options to choose from the existing stock, they get a resale market grant, which is $80,000 plus the household income grant, And there's also a proximity housing grant to encourage families to stay closer to each other. So the grant amounts for resale flats are also very generous. And if we look at the HDB, the house price indices versus the median household income index from 2000 to 2023, this is the index trends. We'll find that the housing prices have actually not exceeded the median household income trends. So the government has managed to keep market prices relatively stable versus the household income. And this is only through many measures on the demand side. We call them market cooling measures because after in the last 12 years, there was a long period of very low interest rates, and this actually caused asset markets worldwide to actually booming prices. So in response to those trends of asset price inflation, the government monitors the housing market trends very carefully, and when necessary, will step in with a round of cooling measures. And you can see that the details of the 16 rounds of cooling measures. I've not included the latest round 2 weeks ago, but the cooling measures take the form of changes to loan to value ratios, total debt service ratio caps, mortgage loan conditions of first property, second property, etc. And then the increase in bar stamp duty, which are now, which were first introduced in 2011, but which has now increased quite a bit for people, for those who invest in the second home or third home for citizens. For permanent residents is another category of buyer stamp duty. And for foreigners, the additional buyer stamp duty is now 60% of the price, which is, I mean, a great deterrence for any foreign investor who wants to buy property in Singapore. So from being told quite unregulated in the past to now having a huge stamp duty. Actually, for Americans, because of the free trade agreement with Singapore, Americans in Singapore don't need to pay the buyer stamp duty. Then there's also seller stamp duty for those who hold their property for less than 3 years. And there are also other market regulations to try to bring down, to cool the market. There's no term use. So besides demand side measures, I now look at the kind of land value capture instruments that are used generally and in Singapore. So in the US context, I think most of your land value capture instruments will work through the property tax systems, special assessments, tax increment financing, through the bond market, etc. So is this type of land value capture instruments are important for financing citywide local infrastructure, such as streets, roads, etc. And commonly used in the US. It's now being tried out in some Latin American countries. In Asia, though, the land value capture instruments have been through government land sales. It started Singapore and Hong Kong doing a lot of that because in Hong Kong the government owns all the land as well, and then release the land for private development. So land sale or leasing is more commonly practiced, and now you have China, Vietnam, and also using this method of land value capture. And this is useful for major strategic projects such as metro systems, and in the case of Singapore, where you capture the land value upfront rather than over a long period of time through the property tax system. So in Singapore, the government land sales program, these are leasehold sales, maximum 99-year leases. So the government will release state land sales program every 6 months. There's a confirmed lease, there's a reserve lease, which can be triggered upon request. And these parcels of land have detailed planning, zoning regulations, detailed sales conditions as to when the property must be completed. And private developers will then purchase the land through a bidding process for various purposes as stipulated by the sales documents, and then have to abide by the planning rules and regulations and sales conditions. So you can, this is well a form of public-private partnership. So in terms of how this land sales are conducted, there are various methods that are used. There's an open auction for smaller properties where more people can afford to bid. And then there's only the price only tender, such as for larger residential development projects. There's also where design is important. There's a 2-envelope system where the design is evaluated separately from the price. And after that, a selection of design is selected, and then the price of this acceptable design are then looked at after the design has been chosen. There are wide sites in terms of the flexibility in determining mixed uses. Then there are master developer request for proposal for large-scale developments. And then there's a fixed price and then best proposal, which are used infrequently, but was used for our Marina Bay Sands, the other resort world in Sentosa. So various methods are used. So proportion of developments and government land sales are substantial, more than 1,700 sites sold since 2019. Every year is ongoing. And as of 2019, you see the numbers there. They account for 40% of housing units and 1/3 of retail space, office space, and hotel rooms. So this is how the master plan in terms of plans, the planner's vision for a particular area is realized. An example of this land sales program is the Marina Bay area, which is the second downtown area. And as you can see, in the 1960s, we had the General Post Office that is now in yellow on the most updated photo. And all around that, you have the high rises that have come up. The river has been dammed up to form a reservoir because we have a water issue as well. So the Singapore River was dammed up to form the Marina Bay, and there's now a reservoir. And the infrastructure that was required to do the reclamation of the land, to put in all the water, sewage, and needs and roads and MRT stations was estimated at about $8 billion, but this is more than covered by the sale of say Marina Bay Sands. Then with this $1 billion for the development, now it's been extended, and there are other sites in the area for commercial downtown development. So the infrastructure has been paid for that way. There's another government land sales program which might be of interest in terms of how it becomes privatized over time. We call it the executive condominium scheme, where the government sells the land to private developer. There's a household monthly income ceiling and other conditions attached to it, citizenship and no ownership of property, etc. The $16,000 monthly cap income is higher than the HDB's cap. There's a minimum occupation period required, and after 5 years of occupancy, it can be sold to a Singaporean or PR. That's the same as the HDB scheme. But after the 10th year, it can be sold to foreigners as well, and it's considered a private property. So this is a way of actually facilitating first home ownership for a targeted group, but then eventually that housing stock becomes privatized over time after 10 years. So there is a whole cocktail of takings and givings in the land and housing sector. On the housing supply side, we have the HDB providing subsidized housing. There's an executive condominium scheme that is givings. On the private housing side, we have the takings from government land sales for private housing development. So within the housing system, there's a lot of cross-subsidization at work there. On the housing demand side, we have that big pension fund savings scheme, and the market is carefully segmented according to who is allowed in which segment of the market, right? Whether it's citizens, PRs, foreigners. It's also segmented by household income. and household profiles such as ethnicity, age, some options are only open to seniors, for example. And for singles, you have to be above 35, so those are all the requirements. It is quite a maze of regulations in the HDB sector. Then we have also different regulations for prime HDB flats in prime location, plus location as standard locations, so that the resale restrictions are different for these prime and plus locations. So there are also all these on the demand side, macroprudential regulations, or rather anti-speculation measures in place. And property taxes are very progressive, from 0% for the lowest property value types to nearly 32% of the annual rental value for the highest value properties. So in terms of housing subsidies, we have here the government subsidizes the HDB about $5.4 billion a year, which is close to 1% of our GDP. But that amount of subsidies which HDB uses to distribute according to household income is actually so-called recaptured, because the HDB buys land from a land authority and the amount is usually equivalent. Okay, but and on a net basis, the government actually does not, in a sense, subsidize the HDB, because it takes, there is a payment for land by the HDB to the government. So in terms of MRT infrastructure, this is fully funded by the government, because the MRT itself facilitates higher density developments and enables more effective land value capture around stations especially. And as you can see, in terms of expenditure, the government actually spends, the transport sector has the largest allocation of development expenditure. The rail lines, the airports, the relocation of the ports, these are our major sectors in Singapore. And the National Development Ministry, under which the HDB sits, has the highest allocation, has the fourth highest allocation for operating expenditure after defense, health, education. So housing is a high priority sector. So in terms of government revenue, because of this ability to capture land value from government land sales, sale of land accounts for a substantial proportion of government's revenue. 19% of the government's revenue actually comes from land sales. That's projected for this year. And it's not part of the operating revenue of the government, but it goes into the official reserves to be invested. We have two sovereign wealth funds that invest the official reserves of the government. And then the dividend and investment incomes are then plowed back into the government's operating budget, government's budget for the year. And if we look at the revenue sources, property tax, stamp duties, betterment tax, and then the so-called externalities tax on motor vehicles, which are taxed very heavily, and then the SIM taxes on betting, liquor, etc. It accounts for nearly 50% of the government's revenue, so that income taxes can be kept low. And consumption tax is also has been increasing, but is progressive because there are rebates based on household incomes. So Singapore basically is a case of how value capture and planning, government supply of housing, and integrating housing retirement savings, careful regulation of housing markets to have this situation of high home ownership and affordable housing. But it's just not one solution, it is so many solutions, so many levers at work. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Pang. Just want to note for the record that Member China arrived at 9:38 a.m. Board members, we have board members or testimony first?
Board members, questions.
Great. Members, any questions or comments? Vice Chair Ishii.
Professor, so if you had the ability to make change in Hawaii, I know you know Singapore. What would you recommend, or what would you say would be a good start for us to start to put some infrastructure or something different for our housing market here?
I think the housing supply side has to be looked at very carefully, because you can see that the HDB is the one that is continuously having a supply program. Right, for next 5 years, we will see 100,000 flats and average 20,000 a year. So that people are assured that there is supply that is forthcoming to the market. And then that's not enough, right? There's also the need to actually curb the demand from foreigners who find Singapore attractive. So there's all these measures now in place to actually restrict demand by foreigners. So the market is actually very carefully regulated. And so I don't, on the supply side, you can take care of the supply through coordination of infrastructure and ensuring that supply of housing that is planned for gets delivered into the market. At the same time, we don't want to oversupply because of this real estate cycles. But the demand side, how is such an attractive state? And how do you actually restrict people who want to just come here for consumption purposes, for holidays, tourists, and there are various ways of trying to curb that foreign demand. I don't think what we do in Singapore is acceptable here, especially if most of your out of state demand is actually American demand, right? So you can't be discriminating against Americans who want to come to Hawaii for holiday homes. So I think Vancouver faces the same situation, and they actually imposed a vacancy tax, or quite high tax rate for homes that are not stayed in. That could one way of trying to deal with the demand from out of state. And of course, in Singapore, we don't allow short-term vacation rentals. Airbnb is banned in Singapore. And what else? Yeah, so there are so many levers that can be considered in addition to the supply part.
Great ideas. Thank you, Professor.
Yeah.
Thank you, Chair.
Other members of the authority, questions or comments for the presenter? Yep, Member Fritz.
I just had a couple questions to get some better understanding. So when someone draws down from their housing allocation in the CPF, afterwards, are they continually contributing to that, like throughout their employment career?
Yes.
Even if they've taken it out and bought housing with it?
Yes, they continue to contribute because the mortgage payments come out of the monthly monthly mortgage. The money mortgage payments come out from their monthly contribution. So that the HDB most have this policy of requiring or watching them withdraw the affordability based on 23%. It should not exceed 23% of the household income, because 23% is what is set aside for housing in the CPF. So that there's no housing is paid for by the CPF contributions, and the take-home pay is not affected by mortgage payments.
Oh, okay, I see. And then I was curious about how the leasehold works at the expiration and also at the resale. So when someone has lived there for 5 years or so and then resells it, is the leasehold renewed? Or?
It continues. So you have to watch what is the age of the property and the remaining leasehold, and that affects the price.
Okay, yeah,
Yeah.
that's what I was trying
Yes.
to get at, because I saw your range there.
Yeah.
Okay, and then at the end of the expiration,
We haven't
How does
reached
that
that
work?
point yet.
oh, okay,
The HDB started selling properties in 1960s, so we have not reached the 99-year mark yet. But in terms of redevelopment, there are actually quite a number of we call them in the private sector and block redevelopments, where the whole condominium might actually go. There's a vote taken, if there's at least 80% agreement, the entire project is put out for bidding to a private developer to basically redevelop, take it down and redevelop. So the prices must be attractive enough from the households to want to do that. And that's where the rezoning and density ratios all that become quite important and watch very carefully, because it's whether it makes sense for, say, a lower density development to go higher density. So that's for the private sector. And a lot of corridor and block developments have taken place already. So the housing doesn't last 99 years. Some of them are like 20 years and they're taken down and rebuilt. And for HDB, some of the older estates which were built in the 60s and 70s have undergone redevelopment as well. So what happens is that no voting process there, the government acquires all the flats in each block and gives the option to buy a new flat somewhere nearby. And the new flat is usually 99 years. And so that's almost like a second windfall for those households who get that HDB, call it selective and block redevelopment. But we're having to plan for that because a lot of towns are now reaching the mark of 50 years. And I think the Prime Minister 2 years ago announced that there'll be a voluntary and block redevelopment exercise when blocks reach 70 years, but the details have not been fleshed out, but we can see already the process has been operating in the private sector market.
Thank you. Thank you, Member Schreitz. Member Light had a question?
It's okay. I figured it out. Thank you. But thank you, Professor, for your presentation.
Any other members? Secretary Apo and then Member Leong. Oh, Secretary Apo, I think you're muted.
There we go. Thank you. First of all, thank you. Incredibly interesting presentation. You know, I guess over the years, one of my concerns, I'm 85, you know, I've been here since 1938. And we've had so much trouble keeping up with carrying capacity of an island. And the model that Singapore has used, I think, is really brilliant in dealing with the reality that there's certain things you have to do in order to provide the kind of security that you do and, you know, equal opportunity and all of that. In Hawaii, one of the problems is that 100 years ago, the relationship that people had with the land was access to the land constantly. There were no boundaries or barriers and where you couldn't, you know. And so in the 40s, 50s, 60s, everybody had a yard. You went and bought a house, you had a yard. You could have parties in your garage and etc. All of that is kind of going out the window, at least on Oahu. This may not be as totally true as I'm stating. So the Singapore model is something, you know, I wish we could pay a little bit more attention to because we're already on it. So in our thing in dealing with Kaka'ako the high-rise communities that we're creating, trying to create real neighborhoods, but with the high-rise feeling, you know, walking, a good walking experiences, walk your dog and all of that. It's a whole different way of living than our history. So trying to make that change, you know, and that transition, boy, we need all the help we can get. And so I thank you for this presentation. I think there's hope for us. Just gotta follow the leader, you know. Thank you.
Thank you, Secretary Apo. Member Leong and then Member China.
Hi, and thank you, Professor Fang. I just wanted some clarification on that chart you had about 90% state land. That's not all the land of Singapore, just the newly reclaimed land, right? That's 90% owned by the state.
No, it's 90% of all the land in Singapore.
Really? What about the private landowners? You just went ahead and Singapore just took ownership of it?
Yeah, we through the Land Acquisition Act.
And the Land Acquisition Act would never pass in the United States. You realize that? But I've admired it. I just was there in Singapore and I asked my friends, well, do you think I could come and live there? Because it seems so orderly. And they said, no, they don't want old elderly people there. But anyway, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Member Leong. Member China?
Yeah, thank you for the presentation. The only question I had was, with regards to like the revenue, and it had like sale of land, for I'm assuming there's some kind of taxation on it. But what is the taxation process on like a sale of a property, and how does that work?
You mean the government land sales? Government land sales are put out through a bidding process. And developers interested in that parcel of land will put in a bid and get, depending on the location of the parcel and what intended use for. So if it's in the CBD, the new CBD area, they expect very high rentals and from banks, and all the parcel of land could be over $1 billion in terms of sale receipts. So that explains why the government land sales receipts are that much, 20% of the overall government revenue. And when government allocates land to the public agencies, they also pay the chief valuation of price for that land. So HDB pays the land authority for the land they use.
I think Member China might be asking, Member China, correct me if I'm wrong. Like if a private seller sells property, can you explain what the rates of taxation are in terms of like the buyer stamp duty? How much of the value of a sale would be captured by the government?
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. For say housing transaction, there is the standard buyer stamp duty, which is up to about 6%, depending on the value of the property. And then there is the additional buyer stamp duty, which would vary according to the citizenship of the buyer. And citizens don't pay, it pays 0% additional buyer stamp duty if it's their first property they're buying, or it's the only property they're going to be buying. As investors, you're buying a second property is 20% of the value of the market price that has been transacted for. So that's a very high deterrence to buy a second property now. And third property goes up to 25%. And then permanent residents pay additional 5%, and then it goes up from there. And then foreigners right now pay 60% additional buyer stamp duty. And business trusts pay 65%. So this is basically to discourage investments in housing sector. This only applies to housing, not for the commercial industrial sector. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Any other members, comments or questions?
I have a question, unless you want.
No, please.
Thank you, Dr. Beng, for presenting this very informative and very helpful, I think, to the board. I was kind of focused on one of your slides, and it's called types of land value capture instruments. And one of the reason why caught my attention was, one of the things we're trying to do as an agency is build infrastructure, needed infrastructure for housing development and so forth, because the lack of sufficient infrastructure is one of the impediments to building more housing or developing more housing, especially in transit-oriented development areas. So one thing caught my eye, and is the air right sale. Can you explain that a little bit? How air right sales work in Singapore?
We don't use that.
Oh, you don't use that?
We don't use that. That particular chart to give overall view of all the possible land value.
Okay, got it.
Instruments out there.
Okay.
But air right sales is actually quite widely used now in Latin America as well. Basically, it's a density increment, and if you want to build higher, you pay a fraction of that increased density to the.
Similar question to Director Nakamoto. Could you expand on the betterment development rights charges and how that functions?
When a property goes for planning permission to up zone or, because the master plan has provided for that, the developer or the owner will have to pay 70% of the estimated increment in land value to the government. And it's called a betterment tax. And the rate is 70% of the market price, so that and to be very transparent about what the payment will be, the chief valuer which sits in income tax department will put out a table, it's called a betterment tax table, every 6 months, so that the table will reflect changes in the property values. So if a redevelopment is going to increase, say, the square footage of commercial land by, X amount, then there's a rate there that tells them that is the rate that they pay for the increase in value, and that rate will of course differ by location. So the table is actually by location. There are 100 over locations where the rates will differ, and in each location, the different land users are given, commercial, retail, housing, low density, high density, etc. So that it can be calculated upfront by whoever is planning to do a redevelopment, the charges that would be paid.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Members, any other comments or questions? Do we have any persons pre-signed up for testimony?
None, Chair.
Okay, and then do we have any persons present or online who wish to provide testimony?
None, Chair.
Okay, so.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Don.
Okay, we'll move on now to the report of the executive director, agenda item 5. Monthly report and other status reports and the monthly financial highlights for July 2024. Executive Director Nakamoto will now provide his monthly report.
Thank you, Chair. In the interest of time, the monthly report for July is in with tab 3, and you have any questions, we can answer those, but in the interest of time, it's there for your reviews. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, members. Any questions or comments on the executive director's report and monthly financial highlights?
No public testimony.
And no one signed up to testify in person or online. Okay, thank you. In that case, that brings us to our adjournment of today's meeting. So thank you to those who joined us today on Zoom or in person. That concludes our business for this at-large meeting. The meeting is adjourned and the time is 10:29 a.m.
Meeting.
Yep, we'll go right into the Kaka'ako